and thank you all for coming. It is a great privilege to be here today with one of the most distinct voices in Nordic fantasy, Maria Turtschaninoff.
Hi, and I wish I could be there with you in person. I'm really, really sorry that I got very, very sick, but I'm glad we were able to manage to meet this way instead.
Yes. At least we have some sort of format, so we didn't have to cancel. So this is great. Maria is a Finnish-Swedish author whose work has resonated far beyond the Nordic borders. Her Red Abbey Chronicles have reached a massive international audience, with the first book, Anaché, being published in at least 28 countries, I think.
I think it's actually over 30 now.
Oh, very impressive. Okay, so her writing has been compared to that of Ursula K. Le Guin, and for good reason. Like Le Guin, Maria uses the speculative genre to challenge patriarchy and heteronormative assumptions about gender and sexuality. She is a prolific and highly decorated author. With the recent publication of the children's book The Manticore, the republication of Anaché, which we will hear from later, and also the English translation of her adult book Tangled Roots, in Swedish called Arvejord, Maria continues to expand the boundaries of the genre. It is truly an honor to finally host you here in the continental part of the Nordics, even though in a hybrid format. So welcome, Maria. Let's give her a big hand.
Thank you.
All right. So to set the stage for our conversation, I will briefly introduce myself. My name is Rikke Ulvedahl. I'm a Ph.D. student here at SDU. My research focuses on the fantasy genre in Danish literature for children and young adults, published from 2000 up until 2025, which I analyze in a queer theoretical lens. In my work, this approach means that universal truths about gender, sexuality, time, and nature are suspended. Desire is no longer a one-way street. Masculinity is not defined by men, nor femininity by women. Time is not valued solely on reproduction, and nature is not an object of possession. This perspective is exactly what drew me to Maria's authorship. While some fantasy works practically beg for a queer reading because they are so rigidly binary, Maria's work falls into a different category. These are stories that are inherently queer and demand a framework capable of honoring them as such. What my research shows is that specific notions of gender and sexuality are always built into the construction of a secondary world. Whether intentional or not, when an author creates a magical realm defining good and evil and the laws of the universe, gender always comes into play. This is because our understanding of gender is deeply intertwined with how we perceive nature and perceive time. In my analysis of the genre, I identify three overall constructions. We have the patriarchal, the matriarchal, and the queer construction. In queer constructions, the restrictions of society are not just present, they are examined and criticized, often by a main character who reveals gender as a social construction. This is precisely what we see in several of Maria's works. I first encountered Maria's writing during a research stay at Åbo Academy in Finland. I was sharing my concerns about how fantasy, despite its radical potential, often falls back on heteronormative cliches. My colleagues immediately pointed me towards Maria. Reading her work, I thought, here it is. Here is an author who truly explores different ways of being male, female, and queer, moving far beyond the conventional hero's journey. I knew then that I had to introduce this work to my students and invite Maria to Denmark to explore these queer feminist narratives. And now here we are, in a hybrid format, but still. So, the plan for today is quite simple. Maria and I will talk for about 45 minutes, maybe an hour. And during that conversation, Maria will also read a selection from her book, Anaché. This exception will be in Swedish. So if you're here and you cannot understand Swedish, well, lean back and just listen to the melodic rhythm of this beautiful language. After that, there will be time for discussion and questions from your people. So for about 30 minutes, we will open up the room for every question you could have or reflection about this fantastic authorship. This is not a strict plan. We'll see how things goes. Now, let's dive into fantasy, feminism, and queerness in the authorship of Maria Turtschaninoff. So, I'm just gonna sit down for this part. Okay. So, Maria, I've often argued that when you build a world from scratch, you are also necessarily constructing power dynamics where gender and sexuality comes into play. When I talk to other authors, they often say that these choices are subconscious. But in your work, the subversion of heteronormative norms feels so precise and consistent. As a theorist, I would call your approach queer feminist. But I want to ask you, is this a conscious, intentional framework you use when building your worlds, or is it simply a reflection of your own worldview?
It's complicated to answer that because I do think it has changed over time. When I started writing fantasy, I was just thrilled to be writing fantasy, and I was very excited and sort of I had wanted to write for a long time, and I was struggling to write for a long time when I was younger. And part of the reason was that I hadn't found my niche or my genre. And when I found my way sort of back to fantasy, which is my original love and my original passion from when I was very little and forward, I really found my voice. And so in the beginning, I was just excited to be writing fantasy. And I think I did a lot of these choices very subconsciously, even still in Anaché, which today maybe surprises me because that is definitely my most queer novel to date. But my thought was always simply that I wanted to reflect our world in a fantasy setting. I mean, we can get into that, but as we probably most of us here know, people who don't read fantasy tend to always read fantasy or say that fantasy is escapism. And for me, fantasy is anything but escapism. It's a way to explore our world with tools that I wouldn't have at my disposal if I was writing contemporary fiction. So I can really spotlight and explore themes that would be difficult to access in the same way if I was writing contemporary fiction. But the longer I have been writing or working as a writer, the more, of course, I have become conscious of these themes, of these traits. I've become more aware of trying to do it the right way. I think in the beginning I was just like, well, the world isn't straight. The world is queer, so it has to be included in my fantasy novels because I want to make them realistic, right? I want to make the reader believe in my worlds. So therefore they are queer because that's how reality is. But the longer I've been writing, the more I sort of also have become maybe a bit more cautious, a bit more like aware of trying to do it in a good way, in the right way, in a sensitive way.
Very interesting to hear that this is something that has taken a bigger place in your thought process as you evolved as a writer. And for a scholar of queer theory, Anaché,
I say Anaché, yes.
Anaché is a fascinating study into the performativity of gender. We see a character who changes gender and experiences a relationship with which I would describe as pansexual, showing how gender is a social construction even in the most rigid of societies. It's a powerful exploration of female masculinity, I think. Was the idea of a non-binary gender a key pillar when you first began building the world of Anaché? And I know it's been many years since you wrote this.
Yes, and I wish I mean, I always want to sound smarter and be like, yes, it was very conscious, but actually it wasn't at first. Um, I had, I was going to, and that's the bit I'm going to read, but I had uh, one day a scene came to me, and the scene was a man cutting a girl's hair. And I had no idea who these people were, what their relationship to each other was, what the culture was, why he was cutting her hair. But I knew that it meant something, that it was a significant act. And basically, I started writing the book to figure out what it meant and what that scene was about. And I thought when I started writing that it would be somewhere towards the beginning of the book, but as you can see, I've marked it to read it. It's pretty much exactly in the middle of the book, actually, maybe past the middle even a little bit. And then it took me a while to figure out what kind of culture is this? Who are these people? How do they live? Because the setting is incredibly important to me when I write, because how humans live and interact with their surroundings molds who they are, molds how they see the world, how they act towards each other, their belief system, their taboos, everything. So it took me a while, but then I figured out these are nomads. They live a nomadic life. And then I did a lot of research into nomadic cultures and how they've lived and what their belief systems have been. And I realized I have to have a sort of, or I wanted to have an animistic belief system in this world because that is consistent with how nomads normally are. And in nomadic animistic cultures, there very often is an aspect of a third gender or a non-binaryism, which often has shamanistic meaning and power.
Mhm.
So that then kind of clicked with that scene I had in my mind, and these sort of pieces started falling into place.
That's very interesting, and I think it's interesting to hear that you did a deep dive into shamanism and animalism when writing this book, because that must have been something that stuck with you, because it's very, I think this mythology is very present throughout your authorship. What I noticed most, the most common theme across your authorship is that there's a striking connection in your books between the domination of nature and the domination of women. It is as if the patriarchal need to tame and weaponize resources mirrors the need to control the female body. This critique is very present in Maundel, the second book of the Maria trilogy, but also in Anaché. Could you share some reflections on how you see the role of nature in your works? Is nature in your world building an entity that is inherently resistant to these power structures?
Wow. Let's see, where do I start trying to answer that? I studied human ecology, both at high school level and at university. So the relationship between humans and nature has always been something I'm incredibly interested in, and maybe my main focus, even after, I mean, even though, especially when my books started being sold abroad, they were very much sort of labeled as Finnish feminist fantasy, which I thought was funny because no one had used the F word in Finland when Maresi came out, for instance. But for me, for a long time, the nature aspect was really maybe what I more consciously was going after. I mean, there are many, many themes in my books, which is again going back to, I think that's one of the strengths of fantasy, that you can have so many big themes in a novel for young readers, mind you.
Mhm.
That if you did that in contemporary fiction, it would be overlaid and it would be unrealistic. It would be, impossible to read. So that's one of the things I also love about fantasy. But so I've always sort of thought about the sort of Western dualism and the dividing of nature, culture, male, female, body, spirit, and tried to sort of write against that, I think. look at other options and other ways of life, other ways of being.
Interesting. It's I find this label, Finnish feminist fantasy, very interesting. You, except for the alliteration, of course, it sounds very good, but I don't know, is there something inherently Finnish about the way you write fantasy? Because I do think there's an argument that the way we perceive nature in the Nordic world, and maybe even more in Sweden and Finland and Norway, here in the continental part of the Nordics, it's a bit different, I think. But is there something like aesthetically from the Finnish world that's just very present in your fantasy, you think?
I mean, that's probably one of those things that's hard to say yourself. It's probably easier to see it from the outside, because how do I know what's Finnish, really,
Yes.
being Finnish? But there are some things. I think when I visited the UK a few times with Maresi, for instance, and with Naundel as well, I think they mentioned things like things I had never even considered, that that it was so refreshing to read a young adult novel where someone loved eating. That eating wasn't a problematic thing. Maresi loves food and revels in describing food that she eats. For me, it was simply a way to invite the reader into the world and make the world vivid and full of texture and smells and tastes. But they reacted to the fact that it's unusual in a YA novel to see someone write about food as not some, a girl main character who doesn't have an eating disorder if it's sort of central. And I think things like that. I was in a panel once with a few other Nordic fantasy writers, among them Siri Pettersen from Norway. And I think it was she who said that in sort of Nordic fantasy, we tend to have more bodily fluids. We're not so afraid of the body as they can be in Anglo-Saxic or other literature, that the body is more present, with snot and blood and semen and all kinds of things, that we don't shy away from those things because it's more natural here. But exactly what is Finnish is hard for me to say. Maybe that relation, I mean, I would say more the relationship to nature than the feminism, maybe. The being close to nature, the not being afraid of the forest. I mean, we know that in many cultures where you travel further from the Nordic countries, people can be like, oh, the forest is a scary place. And here it's definitely not. It's often almost a holy place.
There are so many things that I want to dig into here. So I will just pick one, and then hopefully I will return to a lot of the interesting things you said there. So this label that gets put on you, there's the Finnish part, then there's the feminist part, which is, it's always interesting to see which kind of literature is called feminist. So I find it sort of reductive when people call a book feminist just because it has a strong female lead. What I've learned is that a strong female lead hardly makes a feminist book. To me, your work is queer feminist on a deeper level. You build worlds where the central conflict is often a direct result of binary hierarchies, where the good fight is a struggle against patriarchal structures because they want to put the world into these boxes, culture, nature. So how do you feel about this reading of your work as a structural critique of patriarchy, rather than just stories about strong individuals?
Yeah, I love that. That actually rings really true with me. More so, I mean, that nuances it more than just saying feminist literature. And again, we know that that's easily put on, just like you said, books with strong female protagonists, whatever the hell that is. Who maybe don't talk to another woman throughout the whole book, and does everything the way, saves the world the way men do. And that's actually something I was conscious of really from the start, that I want my main characters to save themselves, their people, the world, whatever it is they need to be saving, in ways that traditionally have been looked down upon as female, the female sphere. Like in Arra, one of my first novels, Arra weaves, and I really wanted to sort of take the knowledge of the female hand and elevate it. In Naundel, the women and non-binary people in the harem save themselves by sewing.
Yes.
So that's something I definitely have. That's something I've been conscious of.
Yeah, there's this feminine heroism by focusing on this sort of woman.
Now your sound went away. I can't hear you. I don't know what happened.
Oh, I'm sorry, Maria. Okay, you're back.
Yes.
Okay, yes, please continue.
No, it's just I was just saying I couldn't hear you. So can you continue what you were saying?
Yes. Okay. Let's hope that doesn't become an issue. Okay. No, I'm just saying it's very interesting how you.
You're gone again.
Okay, Maria, am I completely gone?
Now I hear you. It goes completely silent in between.
Okay, then it shouldn't matter where I stand.
No, I don't think it's that.
Okay, I will. Okay, I will try to continue.
Yeah.
Still there? All right. So again, one more for the ones in the back. So this focus on women's work as a way to save the universe, in fact, in these books, is so interesting because it shows that femininity can be heroic. That is not just a masculine game, and you have plenty of female masculinity in your authorship. But I really like this women heroism that is not dependent on being a side piece to a man. It's and I do think it's very much connected to this more feminine view of nature. So again, there's a lot to dig into here, but actually we want to talk for a short while about this book, Arvejord, who is so interesting because this is the first one of your books that has been marketed as a book for adults. And I recently had a discussion with a colleague about how adult literature is often prioritized by major journalistic outlets, while children's literature and young adult literature is sometimes overlooked by the heavy critics.
What do you mean sometimes?
Every time, all the time. So Arvejord has been marketed as this adult novel. So you maybe already has answered it, but have you felt a difference in how this book has been received and reviewed compared to your previous work? Is there yes, exactly.
Yes, I have very much noticed the difference, a huge difference. Yes. In where I've been invited to speak, in how it has been reviewed, in sort of, yeah, just the respect. I mean, technically, Maresi has been sold to more countries and won more awards. But this is now I'm a writer, now I'm a proper writer. Now I can be invited to the fancy literary festivals and things like that. So and to France and the difference is enormous. So it may be obvious, but how do you feel about that when you sit at these literature festivals and you know that you've made so much amazing work where you also use these themes? There are so many things that goes again, and you actually also have like child narrators in this book. Mm-hmm. There are children present. So again, this distinction. Yeah. I mean, it's not, but I don't know. I've been a writer for almost 20 years now. I'm getting used to it. And we organize ourselves here in Finland, the Swedish-Finnish writers and illustrators who do children's and young adult novels. We've organized ourselves into an organization, and we try and work together because it's really tiring to have to do it on your own. to try and it always, if you're doing it on your own, it always seems like you're complaining that your book didn't get enough visibility, when our point is that it's a huge problem that there was one year that the biggest newspaper in Finnish in Finland didn't review a single domestic children's book. And it's a huge newspaper. I think at least at one point it was the biggest newspaper in the Nordic countries. I don't know if that's the case anymore, but so it's not a small publication, and they didn't review a single Finnish children's or young adult novel.
That's
so
amazing.
It's important to try and work on these structural problems together. But we have, for instance, there's a fairly new festival, but that's really popular and has gotten really respected and gets huge stars from all over the world, called Helsinki Lit in Helsinki. And they have been going for over 10 years now, and they have never had a YA author invited. It's like this incomprehension that adults can actually read books for young readers, that they are literature, and that they have, that the people who write for young people also can discuss literature like professionals, seems to go over so many people's heads.
Yes, and it's actually interesting because the more I've researched children's literature and young adult literature, it just becomes clear that this designation is something that is labeled by the libraries, by the bookstores, by the critics. And the more complex the children's literature gets, I cannot see the distinction anymore. To me, Anaché and Neundel is such an adult-themed novel. I actually think that Neundel is the most adult of your novels, and it's not
Absolutely, I agree. And Neundel doesn't tick any of the boxes of when you try and define what a young adult novel is, because a young adult novel should always be about a young person or many young people, and it cannot be a look back. It can't be an old person looking back at their life. That's no longer a young adult novel. But that's exactly what Neundel is. It's women looking back on their lives. But it's also because it's fantasy, then it has to be for young readers. And also, of course, because the previous novel, Maresi, was a young adult novel, then it's placed in that compartment. I mean, it annoys me incredibly when it comes to visibility and to respect and to, things like that. But I don't mind from the perspective that I think it's really important that our young readers have good literature to read. The problem is if they're not reviewed in the papers, how is anyone going to find them? Sorry. So that's the problem. But at the same time, okay, as a writer of young adult literature, you miss out on many opportunities. But on the other hand, I get to influence young readers in a way that these adult novelists can only dream of, and get to have these fantastic and incredible interactions with young readers and know that what I have written has really meant something to them on a really deep level.
It's really it's so good for the young readers, but it's kind of a shame that the adults are missing out on these incredibly complex universes, because I do feel that, again, the views on gender and nature and sexuality in these books are just so complex, a lot more complex than a lot of adult literature. So let me ask you, when you wrote this Red Abbey Chronicles trilogy, did it concern you that you started off with this very, well, not straightforward, but we are following one main character in Maresi, and then you went on to do this very complex narrative with multiple voices, women being united by oppression. Did that concern you when you wrote this, thinking of publication?
Yeah, it did. And I also knew it got really dark.
Yes.
I joked and said it was like Maresi, but 50 shades darker. and I was like, this is not a YA novel anymore. And what the hell are people going to say? but at the same time, I'm so led by the story. I tried to write something else before that, and then this, after writing Maresia, I was going to write something else. And these sisters started whispering in my ear and wanting me to tell their story. And eventually I just had to obey them and do that. So I very often also, I mean, I know it sounds really woo-woo, but I often don't feel I really have a choice in what story I choose to tell. And then I'm often nervous. I mean, when I wrote Arvejord, after writing this successful YA trilogy, fantasy trilogy, I was like, what the hell am I doing now? Why am I writing for adults? I'm ruining my career. I should definitely continue writing YA fantasy. But again, I didn't have a choice. I was trying to write YA fantasy and it became crap for the first time because there was something else that needed to be told. And then I have to add the little fact that being a part of a language minority has a lot of restrictions. I mean, there's 300,000 people who speak Swedish in Finland. And many people think that because I write in Swedish or we write in Swedish here, Sweden is also a market for us. That is not the case. Swedes are incredibly uninterested in literature from Finland as a rule. And it's really hard to get any visibility or break into that market. And then in Finland, for the Finnish majority, we're considered, our books are translated literature, even though it is Finnish literature. But if it comes out in Finnish, which my books have been, it's still translated. It's in translation. Mm-hmm. So we sort of fall between these two chairs. But it also gives you a certain artistic freedom because you know that you're kind of screwed anyway. Your target audience. I mean, I write for Finnish, Swedish young people, and I write fantasy. You can imagine how small that niche technically is. Now, I have to admit, I have broken out of that niche very successfully, but that was never a given. So that kind of also gives you this sort of, well, I can do what I want because we're never going to be commercially very successful. And that gives you some freedom.
Yeah, creatively, at least.
Yeah, creatively, exactly. So then I can be like, okay, what the hell am I doing? Why am I writing this very, very dark YA novel, which isn't a YA novel? Well, I might as well.
Yeah, that's interesting how the integrity is kept in place by being overlooked in a way. That's this irony. That's very interesting.
And the fantasy, now I'm going to continue a little, sorry, but the fantasy genre also gives you that freedom because, as we also know, fantasy isn't particularly respected in the fine literary circles. It's genre literature, it's pulp, it's whatever. That also gives you a freedom to sort of experiment, to try new things, to push the boundaries, to push the borders, because you're never going to kicked out of the gilded rooms of high literature because you were never in them in the first place.
Okay, so do you fear maybe getting labeled as an adult novelist?
No, I don't fear it, but I fear it. I have noticed now after that book, because it became really loved by adult readers, I fear more that I will get attached to that and let myself be led by that instead of being led by whatever story wants to be told next. I don't want to be led by trying to please an audience.
It is very good to hear. Because again, if you try to please an audience, there's like this. When I've talked to other authors about the thing about the female characters, let me see if I can find this question I have. Okay, so there we go. When I talk to other Danish fantasy writers, they feel a pressure from editors to deliver a conventional happy ending. The idea being that it's necessary for commercial success, especially in literature for young people. You've consistently chosen different, more complex paths for your characters than just this, okay, now we live happily ever after, get married, have kids. So what is your take on this? Do you feel that the industry's hunger for safety and happily ever afters limits the kind of stories we are allowed to tell our children?
Probably, yeah. And I mean, I am aware when I write that I write for young readers. So I don't want to ever give a young reader a completely black, bleak, dark, unhappy ending. I think my responsibility to the reader is to give hope always. And also, I think I would hate it myself. I'm not that kind of writer or person, and I don't like those stories myself. But again, I think I've been saved by being part of this language minority. Honestly, I've never had any pressure from my publisher to write any specific type of story at all. She has always, maybe she's raised her eyebrows when I've come with something new again, but she's never said like, oh no, this wouldn't sell right now, or because again, if something sells in Swedish in Finland, the difference is maybe in a couple of hundred copies. It's not going to be a huge difference normally in commercial success. So that saves me. Again, I know I'm trying to speak generally. I'm privileged that I have somewhat broken out of that mold and actually done pretty well. But that has never been my intention, or I think my editor's intention either, because it's so rare that happens.
Well, yeah, the spoils go to the brave. So a few years back, I know that the film options for Anaché were sold to a British film company called Film 4, I think.
Yep.
And we all know that once a book is optioned, it is in the hand of the filmmakers, and we can only hope that they do the source material justice. But as a fan, as a queer fan, I'm sort of concerned because in your books, Marese's life is defined by so much more than marriage and motherhood. Do you share the fear that her journey may be reduced to a simple, conventional love story when she transitions to film? Because that often happens.
Well, we don't have to fear it because the option has expired and they're not going to make the movie, so it's not a problem. But I mean, I had absolutely zero control over what they did. I knew that once I signed that contract, I sold, any right to say anything about Maria's story. And I did that knowing that was the case and thinking that I hope that everyone can, if it had been made into a movie, that people could see that as a separate work of art and that my books still exist and nothing has happened to them. And if, the movie might have made more people find the books. So that's how I saw it. But I was also really happy that came in later, so I didn't know who was going to write the manuscript. And of course, then when I knew, I couldn't tell anyone because it was super secret. But now I can, because now the option has lapsed. So now I can say that I was really excited because the person who wrote the manuscript, the script for the movie, was Rihanna Pratchett, so Terry Pratchett's daughter.
Oh.
So I was quite, convinced that it was in pretty good hands.
No, that's too bad. So we're missing out on the Marese film.
Yeah, no film forthcoming, unfortunately.
Well, maybe someday.
We can hope.
Well, I have more questions for you, and I'm sure the audience does as well. But I think maybe we should take a breather to hear something from the author herself to remind us that this is art that we are dealing with. So, if Maria would be so kind as to read an excerpt from Anaché.
I will set it up a little. So we're halfway through the book. Anaché is a young girl who has a beloved older brother who she wants to emulate in every way. She wants to be like him. And they grow up in this nomadic, very patriarchal, very rigid society where what men can do and what women can do is very ruled by taboos and norms, and you must never cross these lines. As a child, she has more freedom, but the older she gets, the less freedom she has, and the more her father, who's the the chief of the tribe rules her life and starts, for instance, saying that she has to get married and things like that. Then there's a big storm, and Anaché is separated from her family. It's a winter storm, and there's lots of snow and cold, and she's separated from her family with her horse and has to survive on her own in a cave for quite some time over winter. And now early spring has come and she can finally leave the cave, and she's trying to find her way back through this changed landscape to her family's tents where they lived. And this book has not been published in English, so I'm going to be reading it in Swedish. Landskapet runt omkring henne var lika välbekant som Joakes bruna ögon. Joake is her horse. Här var det, precis här. Inga spår efter Järret syntes till, men hon visste det ändå. Där rann en lilla bäcken som hon hämtat vatten ifrån, och där hade hon börjat bygga fårfållan. När hon lämnade Joake att beta och gick närmare kunde hon ana fållan som en upphöjning i leran. Den hade klarat sig genom vintern tack vare att den varit fryst till is, och bara värmen och regnen hade fått den att erodera. Anaché gick runt resten av fållan fram till bäcken som tack vare regnen svält och sprängt sitt istäcke. Hon hade inte druckit annat än smält snö på hela vintern. Hon böjde sig ner och drack trots att vattnet var så kallt att det bet i hennes tänder. När hon skulle reta på ryggen föll hennes blick på någonting på bäckbrinken. Spår efter hästhovar. Hon sprang upp. Huor, and that's her brother. Hela hennes hjärta sjöng. Huor, det var han, hon visste det. Det kunde vara en ensam häst som överlevt stormen, men hon visste att det var hennes bror. Hon lämnade Joake att beta och vadade genom bäcken utan att bry sig om kylan. Han levde. Hon måste finna honom. Hon följde spåren i leran, de var alldeles färska och tydliga. De zigzackade hit och dit som om de letade efter något bland kullarna som bar uppåt mot brödernas östra arm. Anaché var hungrig och trött. Hon halkade och slant i leran, men det brydde hon sig inte om. Hon var inte ensam. Snart skulle Huor hålla om henne. Hon skulle få dra in hans doft och vara säker och trygg igen. När solen redan stod lågt över horisonten i väst kom Anaché upp på ännu en kulle, och då såg hon honom. Han stod bredvid sin häst på en kulle lite högre upp och gjorde sig beredd att sitta upp. Huor, skrek Anaché. Han såg upp och blev alldeles stilla. Här! Hon viftade med armarna, men han stod kvar utan att röra sig. Då rutschade hon ner för kullen och sprang med sina sista krafter upp för hans kulle. Den var stenigare och hennes fötter fick bättre fäste. Hon var andfådd och darrbent när hon kom upp, men hon fortsatte fram till honom och såg upp mot hans ansikte med hjärtat fullt. Det var inte Huor, det var Kajake, her father. Hans ansikte var magert och hans hår hängde grått och stripigt. Han var så böjd och insjunken att hon kunde ta honom för Huor som var kortare än sin far. Han sa ingenting, bara såg på Anaché med tom blick. Hon öppnade munnen för att tala, men inga ord kom ut. Bredvid Kajake fanns 2 små upphöjningar av lera. De var nygrävda. I ena handen höll han en spade som ännu var smutsig av jord. Nu såg Anaché att kullen också var beströdd med ulliga högar i grått och brunt. Det luktade. Det var det som var kvar av fårflocken. Du fann dem. Kajake såg på henne en stund. Aldrig hade hennes far sett så länge in i hennes ansikte. Det blänkte till i hans ögon. Han sträckte fram armarna mot henne. Ja, jag fann dem och jag begravde dem. Här vilar din syster och din mor, min son. Men jag fann också dig, Huor, och jag tackar Kymenlaakse. Anaché stod helt stilla. Hon ville tala, men Kajakes blick var så stark och höll henne fastlåst i sitt grepp. Du har magrat och ditt hår har vuxit långt som en flickas. Men du har överlevt stormen och funnit din väg tillbaka till din far. Jag är stolt över dig, min son. Anaché såg på de 2 gravarna. Där vilade det. Här stod hon, levande, framför sin far, roken. Man sa det inte emot en far. Man sa det inte emot en rok. Kajake ställde ifrån sig spaden och öppnade en av sadelpackarna som hängde på hästens sida. Med tröga fingrar drog han fram en kniv. Vi vilar här i natt och förrättar dödsriterna tillsammans. Imorgon ger vi oss av söderut. Du får rida med mig på jackel. Anaché stod mycket stilla. Hennes far närmade sig henne med höjd kniv. En svag nattvind kom kilande ner från bergen och drog in under hennes våta kläder. Kajake tog tag om hennes hår med ena handen och skar av det med kniven strax under hennes öron. Knivbladet tuggade sig mödosamt genom hennes trassliga, smutsiga flätor med ett hungrigt läte. Kajake höll det avskurna håret en stund i sin hand, sen släppte han det. De tyngre flätorna föll till marken medan vinden tog tag i några lösa strån och förde dem med sig västerut. Så, nu ser du åter ut som min son. Kom, låt oss göra ett läger för natten. Och så gick Kajake Kalkas Rok ner för kullen där han begravt sin hustru och sin dotter, och efter honom gick hans son Huor, som ensam överlevt den värsta vintern i Akades minne. Huor var rädd, men han lyssnade och försökte förstå.
Thank you, Maria. So this passage, as you just revealed to us, is like the whole, what can I say, like this is where the whole story springs from. You thought about this scenes and then it just spiraled into this whole big universe. Can you tell us some more about this process, because it's very specific with the father whose grief caused disillusion. Can you just put some more words to it?
Yeah, it was really shaped very, very much by the research I did. I often do quite a lot of research, even though I write fantasy, in order to make the world believable, realistic and alive for the reader. I use our world as a stepping off point. Often I have to tone down our world, because the craziest things, if I put them in a novel, people are going to say they're unrealistic. So a lot of it was shaped by learning more about nomadic cultures, learning about how they view nature, how they view their surroundings, what type of mythology they have, and then specifically shamanism. So I looked at shamanism both in the Sami area and other areas of the world, what it's looked like, what they've believed in. And that really sort of shaped, that's why I have to do all this research, because it shapes the culture I'm describing and it shapes the lives of the people. So through reading about these cultures, who sometimes are more non-binary and sometimes are very rigid, the Akade culture sort of came to life for me. And then that shaped who these people are, how they relate to each other, and suddenly I saw why Kajake is cutting her hair. Through grief, or maybe it's a more conscious, it's never really clear if it's grief, if he's mad, or if he is very calculating, that he cuts her hair and makes her into his son, because a son is the only thing that's worth anything in their culture. And everyone there is, struggling to survive and struggling to keep their position in society. So he does what he needs to do in order to remain the chief, remain a respected leader. And for that, he needs a son.
It's very interesting, this mythological, magical system that you put together, because in a lot of Anglo-Saxon fantasy, it is built on Christian myth, like Narnia, for instance. While in Danish fantasy, we often lean on Norse mythology. Your work is deeply connected to shamanism, Nordic paganism, and I've heard you speak in, I think it was promo for Arvejord or something, about the spread of Christianity as an assault on nature.
Mm-hmm.
A theme that is so present in Arvejord and Tangled Roots. How do the mythological systems in your book act as an opposition to Christian or patriarchal organizations of society?
How do they act? Well, in very different ways. I mean, in different novels. In Maresi, since I knew very, very quickly that that book was set in an abbey, that meant that the women who live in this abbey have to worship something. So I had to create some kind of belief system or religion. And since it's a fantasy world, I didn't want to use anything too known from our world. So I looked at what we believed in before we got these three big monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And I found a lot of goddess worship in times before. So I used a lot of that research to create their belief system. So I think a lot of this, a lot of what I write about are things that are basically quite directly from our world, but from before the monotheistic religions took over and started dominating. So I think that's why they really resonate with readers on a sort of very archaic level, because it's things that we have in our DNA, in our subconscious, very much these belief systems. And in Arvejord, I decided that I wanted to write. Arvejord is an episodic novel set in a small village in Ostrobotnia in Finland, and it spans 400 years. And in order to write that book, I had to do about a year's worth of research. And I wanted to see how our relationship to nature has changed over time and why. And sort of, it's my book about the climate change without using the word climate change a single time.
Yes.
And what I learned doing the research for that book is that it really was Christianity that sort of broke the natural bonds with nature and started teaching that wild nature is evil. This was actually not something I knew, even though I have studied human ecology before that. But early Christianity, or 16 and 1700s Christianity, very much taught that the wild nature is evil. It's the home for the devil, and only cultivated land is Christian and good, and thus it's man's task on earth is to cultivate the land and make it Christian. So there was no reason, like there was no value in wilderness, in wild natural nature. And that has really, that together with the sort of dualistic masculine, feminine nature, civilization or culture, body, spirit, has really shaped how we view and use nature.
Definitely. I just finished Arvejord yesterday, and it's going to stick with me for a long time because it's so interesting. Nature, the earth, is always there in this book as time goes by. It's not something you can claim, not really, as it's proved over and over again by nature. It is something you can connect to in a temporary moment. It's relational, so it's not about possession. It seems like in this book you actually managed to, well, it seems like the earth and nature is the one who's gazing at the people and around. They are living there, they are there, but they are not looking at nature. Nature is taking them into view. It's so clear with all these narrative shifts that you do. Can you say maybe more about how you achieved that effect? Because you read this and you really feel like, okay, it's nature who's observing me.
Yeah, my thought was that we think we're so bloody important, and what we do is so incredibly important. And yes, we can ruin nature, but it won't disappear. Like that place has been there before any humans came to it, and it will be there after humans have left. It is eternal, no matter what we do to it. it is, or not eternal, but definitely much more eternal than we are, and what we do is. So that was my sort of starting point. And I viewed nature in this swamp, this moss, as the main character of the book, and the human beings, the people, are dragonflies. Like what we think of when we see dragonflies, they live for a day and then they're gone.
Yes.
And for nature, for the place, that's what humans are. They're one day and gone the next.
I need to recommend it highly to everyone, whole authorship, but this Abbey, if you're afraid of the fantasy label, that's the place to go. Although it has fantastic elements as well. So again, that genre designation is just, well, wrong. Okay, so I think this is a good time to open up for questions and reflections in the room. So, does anyone want to share? And I'm sure you can feel free. I think Maria has probably heard most of it before.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. It's really inspiring and interesting in so many ways. I was wondering, you describe your background as sort of constricted and a small world, the Swedish Finns, like the 300,000 people, but it's also a very rich culture. I mean, if you don't think about numbers, what's your relationship to the sort of literary world of that you come out of, the Swedish Finnish sort of literary history?
Oh yeah, I mean, it in a sense, the Swedish Finnish culture is Finnish culture for many hundreds of years. When it comes to literature, when it comes to art, music, most of it was done by Swedish speakers because of the structure of the society at the time. So I've always felt that I sort of, yeah, I mean, as many have said before me, that I rest on the shoulders of the giants before me. And when I started writing fantasy, for instance, there really wasn't anyone who was doing it in Swedish in Finland at the time. And fantasy, well, there was one writer, but and fantasy wasn't very big yet. I mean, the big boom hadn't arrived when I started writing fantasy. The Harry Potter had just started coming out, I think, and George R.R. Martin's world domination hadn't quite started. So the mainstreamification of fantasy definitely hadn't happened yet. But I had these other writers in Swedish that I could look to, both in Finland and also in Sweden, and especially ones who wrote for young readers like Tove Jansson and Irmelin Sandman Lilius, who was my literary hero growing up, and who was the writer who showed me through her books that you can write fantasy that's not Anglo-Saxon, that's written in Swedish, in Finland, that uses dialect almost in a way that it almost becomes like a Tolkien-esque magical language, and where girls are in the main parts. So that was really, I think, I don't know if I would have given myself permission to write what I did if she hadn't been a big part of my childhood and her books, Irmelin Sandman Lilius. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. I was thinking about in the middle of Anaché, there's this big winter thing. I was, of course, thinking of Tove Jansson's novel about the big winter. Is there Absolutely. A similarity there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to be a Finnish writer and not to be very influenced by Tove Jansson.
Yeah.
But also we have, if we go further back in time, and we have Topelius, who wrote for children specifically a lot, and this sort of fairy tale tradition, which is very strong, and the national poet of Finland, Runeberg, and the sort of maybe mythologization of the past, I think, can also be seen in my novels very much, that comes from those writers.
Other questions from the room, reflections, also to share. Yes, in the back.
Yes, I don't know how loud I need to speak.
No, I hear you perfectly.
Oh, good. Okay, so I was wondering, perhaps in your talks with the younger readers of your works, how conscious they are of the sort of the confrontation of gender norms, if that comes across in their way of speaking to you, whether they sort of interpret this as a sort of, you know, this is the natural way of things, the way that it's presented in your works, or whether they seem aware that this is indeed something that stands in opposition to what they may be used to or maybe hearing from other places.
No, that's interesting. I haven't actually noticed that when I meet young readers at all. But I think that's sort of the beauty of fantasy, that young readers read it as an adventure. And when Narnia came out, there was some pushback from adults that you can't write this dark stuff for young readers. But the readers don't see it as dark as we do, because the young readers, because they don't have the same framework, the same references. They don't quite understand what is happening in some of the scenes and some of the themes. And it's the adults who, have more cynicism and more experience of the world that see how dark it actually is. And I think that's absolutely the beauty of fantasy. The good fantasy can have all these layers, that for a younger reader, it's an exciting adventure. And the older you get, the more you can see and appreciate the other layers. But at the same time, I'm fairly certain that some of these themes go into them without, it's like taking medicine without noticing that you're taking medicine. That's my theory anyway, that they get inoculated against patriarchy by reading my books. Okay, now I'm exaggerating, but maybe you get what I'm saying. Like, for instance, there was, I will never forget, one of the sort of big experiences for me as a writer was meeting a girl at the Göteborg book fair who came by my signing table and clearly wasn't aware that I was there, and saw my book Arra and sort of stopped in her tracks, really surprised. And then her eyes went up and she saw me and she burst into tears. And Arra is about a girl who finds her voice. And I talked to her for a while, but she was crying a lot, so it was hard to get very much from her. But I saw her again last time I was at the Göteborg book fair. And she came up and said, "I don't know if you remember me." And I said, "I do remember you." And she said that it was a really, really tough time in her life. And Arra was one of the things that helped her through. So again, I think that even if they can't verbalize it or put words on it, it does affect them.
Thank you. That must have been incredibly rewarding.
Yes. See, that's what those people who only write for adults never get to experience.
Exactly. It's interesting about this with the adults and children's literature. Like, it's the adults who says that's children's literature, and it's the adults who says this is what it means. But it's this debate about what is harmful for children. It comes up with every literary generation, multiple times actually. I think a big example is Astrid Lindgren and Brothers Lionheart from Løvehjerte, where critics, adults, feared that it was encouraging children to commit suicide because of Nagiela. And the children were fine and alive. Yeah. What it did was that it gave this generation of children, and every generation since then, a language for death. So now they were able to discuss it and talk about it. And I feel like with fantasy literature particularly, that can be done for queer gender and sexualities as well. Give a language to it.
I mean, it's the world that's a dangerous place, not art.
Yes. Well put. Okay. One question. Yes.
I was wondering, since, as I understood it last semester, in queering, we also, lose our relationship with chrononormativity. So I wondered if it's even relevant, or if it will continue to be relevant, talking about young adult or older adults, if the story in its like DNA is not normative to your age anyway. I don't know if that's specific enough, or just a comment. Is there a prognosis that in the future it might not be so important if it's young adults or just adults?
I don't know if I'm really like the right person to speak on that. I just write, and it's other people who put these labels on things. And I do understand that, for instance, for marketing purposes and in libraries, they need to shelve things and stuff like that. But it's never been particularly important to me when I write. And I know other YA writers who say, sorry, still not healthy, who say the same thing. And those denominations tend to move and slide all the time anyway. And then suddenly the industry invents some new term called, what was it recently? New adult, and then what the hell is that? Who knows? And I mean, I think those things will keep coming and going, and we will keep writing our books, and the readers will keep finding them however they find them.
Thank you.
That is interesting. This thing about we keep putting labels on this fantastic literature. So there's children's literature, there's young adult, now there's new adult. I think they are slightly older than the young adults. And then there's urban fantasy and high fantasy, and it's hard to keep track of. What I think is important is that the book resonates with the reader. And if it's marketed towards a child and an adult reads it, who's harmed?
Yeah. And I'm really glad that actually a lot of adults have found my novels too. And they will come up to me and be like, well, I don't normally read fantasy, but I did read yours. I'm like, it's okay. It's okay. I kind of see my books as, because in a sense, for being fantasy, they're quite fantasy light, right? We have humans only. There are so far no dragons. I do love fantasy, and I love all those things. I'm not talking down dragons ever. It's just that I have found it difficult to do them in a new way. And I think early on in my career, I limited myself somewhat. I was afraid of writing cliches. I was like, okay, has this been done? Has this been done? And I put a lot of boundaries around my writing, probably unnecessarily. But I think in the end, it became my strength. It forced me to develop my own style and my own way of building these worlds and writing these characters. And I'm really just interested in, as you can see in the books, exploring our world, exploring themes that are important to me, that make me upset or angry or happy in my books. And now I lost my train of thought. Where was I going with this? We were talking about adult. Yes, in that sense, they're not so scary for readers who don't normally read a lot of fantasy. They're maybe more approachable because there's not so much of that weird fantasy stuff until later on, when I've already sort of reeled them into the book.
So I think there was a question here.
Yeah, I was just, you were talking about how the story of Anaché sort of sprung from this one sequence of her father cutting her hair. I was just wondering, would you say that sort of characterizes your writing process, or is that sort of the odd one out, or how?
No, it definitely is very much. Actually, what characterizes my writing process is that I never know how a book is going to come about. And I have to sort of invent the wheel anew for every book, and every book demands to be told in a new way, and I find each story in a different way. But what characterizes them, I think, is very little planning, at least early on. that I get an image, I have an idea, like I told you guys with Anaché. Arra, the novel before that, came about because I saw a girl sitting under a table with tangled hair, and something about her made me think that she was like a wild animal. And I thought, okay, why do I get this impression that this girl is like a wild animal? I mean, this was all in my head. And I thought, because like an animal, she can't speak, or she can, but she doesn't speak. And I started writing to figure out why does she not speak, and what does it mean? And Maresi was born out of three, if I simplify it, out of three sort of impulses or ideas. The very, very first was that I visited a photo exhibition in Helsinki many years before I started writing the novel. And the photos were from the holy Mount Athos in Greece, where there's an Orthodox monastery that's over 1,000 years old. And I often go by myself to art exhibitions, different galleries, look at art or movies even, and things by myself with a notebook, actively looking for input and ideas. And these photographs from Athos were very inspiring because it has been a very rich, prosperous monastery. So the buildings in the middle of the island are gilded and have like lots of finery, but now there's only like a handful of monks left, and everything's sort of falling into disrepair. So it's like faded glory. And then along the shores, the buildings that are on the shores are often perched up on these very high, steep cliffs, like birds' nests. And they're more like fortresses because there's been so much war in the Mediterranean and unrest. So they're more sort of defended with little slits for windows, and they would winch up the food from the harbors with ropes on these steep cliffs. So very sort of, it put my imagination to work. And at the same time, I got really mad because still to this day, women are not allowed to come to this island and have never been allowed on it for 1,000 years. And I thought, well, what would happen if you did the reverse? If there was an abbey, an island with an abbey, and only women and girls were allowed. But there would be a reason, because I write fantasy, there would be a concrete reason why men aren't allowed or maybe shouldn't go to that place. So that was one thing. And then I started at some point when I was, after writing Anaché, I was looking for my next story. I started writing little writing exercises. I thought, okay, let's explore this idea of this island and these women and girls. And I started writing different little texts about the place, sort of trying to get a feel for it myself. And in one of the texts, a girl talked about her day, and one of the novices talked about her day in the abbey by describing each door she went through. And the door to the dormitory, the door to the bath, the door to the schoolroom, etc., etc. And she contrasted it with her home, where there had been 2 doors, And I just really liked her voice. And she was a first-person narrator, and I sort of immediately kind of fell in love with her a little bit, and I wanted to know more about her, and I let her tell more of her story. And eventually she became Maresi. And then I had a setting and I had a main character, but I needed something to happen. I needed action. And then I took one more thing that I had made a note of. I always carry notebooks with me everywhere I go, of an article I had read, again, many years prior, about a girl who had been buried alive by her father because she had talked to a boy. And I have since forgotten what religion, culture, or country this was about, and I think that's good because it's not important. But I remember a detail that I didn't use in the book, and that was that after they had buried her alive, they built a hen house, a chicken coop on top of her grave. And so I decided to give that story to a new girl who comes to the island, who has seen her sister be buried alive and who is fleeing the same fate. So this way, like, every story comes about in slightly different ways, but often in the beginning very intuitively, and then the more I work on the story, the more I have to become more conscious and more do research and planning and things. But in the beginning, it's a very sort of, there's some spark that sets it off.
I think this is a very interesting process, that you have like this visual, this image, and then you ask why, how, why are we there? But it must be hard to stick to the image also, because when you're creating these big worlds and they become so lively and dynamic, you need to still keep your eyes at that specific picture, that visual. Do you find a challenge in that, or is the image just so clear?
That part isn't challenging. Many parts are, but that specific part, sorry, hasn't been challenging for me, because it's often, that image is often about a person. And once I found the person, then I sort of can hold on to that and let them lead me through the story. The challenges are more often that it can be about actually making the world come alive, finding what it looks like for me, so that the images become vivid enough so that I can describe them in a way that really brings in the reader to the book, which was for a while the problem with the third book in the trilogy, the Breven from Maresi, that I had trouble finding what her home place looked like, the village, the area she came from. What does it look like? And before I found it, I couldn't find the people. They became the cardboard cutouts that I tried to move around a flat stage, because they couldn't interact with their environment and their surrounding, and none of them felt real or alive. And it wasn't until I found the place that I could find the people. So there's other challenges like that, but often, if I've had one of these strong starting images, that has often just stayed with me.
Any more questions?
Aina.
Thank you very much for great talk. It's very interesting to hear about the process. You said at the beginning that you want to reflect our world in a fantasy setting, and it got me thinking about experimental philosophy, where there's been a few studies that show that if you give people different texts in order to deal with ethical dilemmas, the most effective way getting them to deal with ethical dilemmas is not a philosophical text or a theological text or a scientific text. It is a fictional text that pushes them in a particular direction. And throughout the talk, you've reflected upon how the multiplicity of the world affects things, and you've talked about discovery and truth and vagueness. So I was just wondering, putting a bit on the spot here, but is there a particular direction that you want to lead your readers in?
I don't think I have. I mean, if I'm quite honest, I don't think I have one. I've never thought like, this is the direction I want to lead my readers into, right? But of course, I write about things, about my own values. I write about things that are important to me. In Naundel, very much I wrote about things that upset me or make me worried about the world or angry about how women are treated and things like that. I mean, I only have myself as a tool, really. As a writer, I am my most important tool, in a sense. If I write about someone who's scared, I have to think about what did it feel like when I was scared. If I write about someone who's angry, I have to think about what my own anger feels like. But the one time when I've tried to be the most conscious about leading the reader in any certain direction was definitely with Arvejord. And as I said, it's my book about the climate crisis without ever talking about the climate crisis at all. Because reacted to, I mean, this wasn't the reason I wrote the book, but it was maybe became a reason of why I wrote the book the way I did, that we have a lot of dystopia around that climate change. A lot of writers write dystopian literature to sort of try and show us where we're going to head if we don't take action in time, and some of it's very good. But I actually doubt that changes anyone. That scaring people, is that really the way to change anyone's mind? And so I decided that what I wanted to do was use love. I wanted to remind people of the love that exists between humans and nature, between people and a place, and between people and people. I wanted to use love as the engine throughout the whole book, and instead remind people of where we come from and what we could have if we made different choices. So that's maybe the book where I've been the most conscious about. I hate the word message, but you know what I mean. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so, yes. Do you happen to know the sort of subgenre that's coming up of solar punk?
No. Hope punk, I know, but not solar punk.
It takes the same sort of technology view of cyberpunk, but in a utopian spin instead of a dystopian.
Sounds like hope punk. Maybe it's, again, these terminologies just sort of interlace. Can you give me an example of any work in that genre?
Becky Chambers about the monk and the robot.
Yeah, I've heard that called hope punk. That was exactly what I thought about. So I love those books.
Any more reflections and questions? We have time, so. Okay. Well, I have a question, of course. So we are already like talking about it, and you mentioned the word escapism earlier. And when we had a meeting earlier this week, we talked about this Swedish tabloid newspaper, Aftonbladet, who did a review of Anaché. And it was a positive review, no doubt, but they called it escapism. And that's just rubs me the wrong way, because it implies that the world building has nothing to do with the real world.
Mm.
At the same time, you were praised for reflecting current gender issues. So what do you feel about that review? You're at once being called someone who writes escapism, but also something that is very near and dear to queer people.
Yes, but it was also mentioned that I had probably done it by accident. Now we're recording this, so maybe I shouldn't say what I actually thought. I don't know what you're going to use this for. I mean, I was very happy to get a review in a Swedish tabloid, because I don't think that's ever happened before. But at the same, I wasn't surprised. Let's put it that way, because this is often when people who don't read fantasy suddenly read fantasy, they don't quite know what to make of it. As simple as that, and they assume that fantasy has to be escapism, so they read it with those glasses, and they assume that the disruption of the normative narrative has to be accidental. And I'm sure, I mean, again, I would never in a million years compare myself to Ursula Le Guin, but I'm sure that she got the same kinds of reactions as well, that it was very hard. I mean, I think now people see how incredibly, experimental and groundbreaking she was in what she did. I'm not saying, again, no comparison, but
I compared you to her in the introduction, so that's where we are.
But yeah, I guess we just have to keep being subversive and making those people who don't read fantasy read our fantasy, and slowly chip away at these images of fantasy being escapism and something to look down upon. And I mean, we have many examples from around the world of proper fancy writers who write books that in every respect can be categorized as fantasy, and vehemently denying that it is fantasy that they have written.
And again, you just throw a hand in the air if you think of something, but I'm just going to continue a bit with Anaché, because it was republished. That's why I got the review now. It was originally published in 2013. So
12, I think.
12, yes.
I think so.
Why do you think that there's this renewed interest in this particular narrative? If you would say that that's the case.
It's the book that most readers have come up to me and say, where can I get a hold of it? Because it's been sold out for so long. Like, oh, I want to get it for my niece, or I never got my own copy, and where can I buy one? And I always had to say, sorry, you can't. There is none available. And so I took this to my publisher a few times and said, people are really asking for this book. I'm not going to say clamoring for it, but they were asking for it. So I was very lucky that my publisher decided to reissue it as a paperback, so that it's available again.
I was too. It's maybe my favorite. So, yeah. So I've noticed, and this it may be some of the last questions here, but I noticed a specific narrative structure in not all your books, but many of them. You have this prologue that describes a legend or a myth that was created after the book, the events of the book takes place. You are essentially telling the reader right away that the main character will become a legend. Why have you chosen this framing? I see it in Anaché and in Ara and in Maria also. What does it do for the reader's experience to know that from page 1 that they are reading an origin story of a myth?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I think I do it most clearly in Arra, where I really sort of state that this is going to be a legend. I don't know. I think it might be. I will have to sleep on this and think if I have like a deep reason for doing it. But I think part of it might just be because I love myths and legends myself. And I love sort of the feel and the mood of them. So it might be something as simple as that.
Oh, that's a good direct answer. So, okay, so maybe I'm getting a bit too nerdy here, but let's have it. Because you often experiment with shifting narrators. You did it in Unterforsch, where the story is split between a boy and a girl. You did it in Naundel, where it just becomes so complex because of all these women talking, and they are united by oppression by one very bad man. And I cannot even begin to describe the narrative complexity of Arvejord. So I guess my question is, what are the pros and cons of using such a complex polyphonic narrative strategy instead of staying with one character, which you also have done?
Well, I think the reason I do it, there are many reasons. In Naundel, I many times regretted my decision as I was writing it, because it was really difficult to write and to keep these women apart and keep the pace up, and it was a nightmare. And I was like, why am I doing this to myself? But I think one of the reasons is that I am a very ambitious writer, and I find it difficult to write the same book again and again. So with every book, I try, again, subconsciously mostly, to do something I haven't done before. I want to learn something new. I think maybe because I'm easily bored, so I need to keep myself, sharp. I need to keep myself interested in the story and in the telling of the story. So a lot of it has to do with that I wish I could just copy a success like Maresi and just do that again and again, but I honestly can't, even if I try. I always think of some way to make it more complex or complicating it somehow. So I think that's simply the reason why I do it. And with Arvejord, I don't even know how I came up with the structure, but things, it's easy afterwards to make a narrative of how you wrote the book, and then you start believing the narrative. When the fact of the matter is that it is really complex and things go in and out and are very and it's hard to know what came first and what came second. But that the whole idea of the place as the one constant in the book, and the people as dragonflies coming in and out of the story, shaped it. And then I really wanted to reflect the passage of time in the language of each text to the best of my ability, so that when we're dealing with the 1600s, I don't use 1600s Swedish because it would be, impossible to read for a modern reader, and I probably couldn't write it very well either. But I wanted to give the feel of it being a long time ago, of being archaic language. And then as time passes, I make the language change. And I also then want to reflect the different narrators and their point of view. And I found it a wonderful challenge and a lot of fun, actually, to write each text in a different, not just language and voice, but also genre, so that we have prose poetry, we have letters, we have diary entries. I really sort of felt that I got to use all the tools in my writer's toolbox, which was a joy to do. Simply, like, I really got to stretch all my muscles and really, again, try new things. I'd never written any kind of poetry before. And I'm like, why I'm writing prose poetry? Help, what is happening? And I felt with that book very much like, when they had apprentices, and at one point an apprentice would have to do the sort of, I don't know what it's called in English, but mästarprov, to become a full person of their trade, whatever it was, if it was a smith or a tailor or whatever. So I felt very much that this was sort of my mästarprov. I had to use all the skills I had learned as a writer up to then to write it in this very sort of episodic way, with very different narrators of very different styles.
Okay, so this was I think in Danish we say svenneprøve as an author. Very interesting, because you succeeded very well, and you also get the sense that you had a lot of fun writing this as from a technical perspective, also getting to flex your muscles. And I do feel you succeed very well. And I mentioned earlier that I read this book and I got that sense of it's the earth who is I won't call nature a main character, but it's the nature who's looking at the people. And I think you achieved that effect because you are also experimenting with the different kinds of text, the different narrative formats. So you have the poetry, and you have the first person narrative and the third person, and all this detaching from the idea of the human exceptionalism, the main character who is creating something of nature and not the other way around. So that's so interesting to read. But
and one of the big challenges with that book was that, coming from YA fantasy, I was incredibly aware that now I'm writing something that can be maybe labeled as a historical novel, historical fiction, and the reviewers are going to sit, the experts are going to sit and be like, those are not the kind of trousers someone had in 1738. So I did a lot of research. I did about a year's worth of research, just only research for the novel, from like Finnish history to Österbottnian history to personal history to the history of women and children in Finland to the history of Finnish forestry, the church in Finland, school system, like everything. I had to try and get everything right. I even read a thesis about what farmers have named their cows in the different centuries in Finland, and their horses and their dogs and cats, so that I would get the name of the livestock, correctly. And then suddenly I had all this enormous amount of material. And if there's something I hate is reading a book where the author has to show the reader all their research.
Yes.
And it just weighs down the text, and it becomes heavy and cumbersome and boring. And I was like, how am I going to handle all this material so that the book is correct, but it's not about the research?
Can you just repeat that last part you said you were falling on?
Yes. So my challenge was, how do I handle this all this material so that the book is historically correct, but that it's not about that research. And in the end, what I did was I used a collage by the Swedish artist Lars Lerin as my sort of visual inspiration. It was a collage he makes watercolors, and it was watercolor sketches from a beach. So each little picture was like a feather, a piece of seaweed, some rocks, some sand, a seashell. And each individual sketch was very simple. But together, they formed this picture of the sea or the beach. And you could really, smell the salty sea air and hear the seagulls cry when you looked at the whole collage of art. So that was what I was aiming to do with the short text in Arvejord that I wanted. I knew that none of them could individually carry the theme of the novel or all the themes of the novel. And I had to try and keep them as light and delicate as Lars Lerin's watercolors, and that together, and trust that together these images, these texts would make the whole picture.
Very interesting to hear. But now it becomes interesting to think about these 5 books you have in the same universe. So you have the trilogy of Maresi and Ara and Anaché, I think, taking place in the same closed world building, right? Can you, maybe we already know the answer, but why did you keep returning to this world? The complexity just becomes, it's not messy at any point. It's very, very, very clear narrative in each book, but it's such a huge world. What compelled you to do that?
Well, I think that's the best bit about being a fantasy writer. That's like the juiciest part, that I get to create the whole world, and it's my playground, and I get to go there and play. And I'm not Tolkien. I haven't planned the whole world. I haven't drawn up the maps and made the mythology and the history and the culture. I am instead like an explorer. With each book, I go to a new place. It's like a white spot on the map, and I get to discover what's there. So it's delightful to get to be an explorer.
Well, I hope you get to keep exploring, because it's a very interesting line of books you have. I've enjoyed reading up on your authorship so very much.
Thank you.
We are nearing the end here, so last chance to ask a direct question to Maria Turtschaninoff. All right, then I'm just gonna round things up here. So Maria, thank you so much. Speaking with you today has confirmed why your work is so vital, not just as fantasy, but as a space where we can actually imagine different ways of being. It's been a privilege to explore these queer feminist narratives with you. So, will you all join me to give a huge hand to Maria Turtschaninoff?
Thank you very much. It was delightful. I wish I could have been there in person, but this was also really fun. And now I can go and cough by myself, and I don't have to cough on you.
I sincerely hope that we get a chance to meet in real life at some point in the near future. I'm in Finland about twice a year, so maybe.
Yes, that would be delightful.
All right.
I have a lot of questions now I want to ask you about some of the things you said. I was like, ooh, I want to learn more about masculinity not being led by men and femininity not being led by women. That would be so interesting.
This is the thing I love when talking to the practitioners, because the research and authors, they have a lot of things in common and think they can learn from one another. So yeah, let's definitely set that up.
Yes, great.
All right. So for the rest of the people in the room, please take some fruit. Nobody has taught us.
Eat fruit.
And bring some coffee. And I'm here for further discussion if anyone is interested. And with that, we are going to say goodbye to Maria.
Bye. Lovely to
Bye.
meet you all. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Bye.